Good morning. I'm Jenny LeRae, and welcome to today's Research America Alliance member web meeting. As always, we thank you for your participation in the Alliance, and thank you for joining us today. Since we're using Zoom webinar, all audience members are on mute. You can use the electronic raise hand feature at the end of the discussion, and we will unmute your line for a verbal question, or you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. That is our housekeeping, and I'm really pleased to introduce today's panelists. Let me say that the topic was spurred on by a recent executive order, 13948, which the president released on September 13th. But it's not the first time some variant of this policy in the EO has been proposed either by the administration or Congress. Our guests today are our economist, Dr. Lou Garrison, professor of pharmaceutical outcomes research and policy at the School of Pharmacy at the University of Washington, and reimbursement and payment expert, Dr. András Incze. He's the founder and CEO of Akceso Advisors and a lecturer at BW State University in Germany. Dr. Garrison and Dr. Incze will share part of a presentation they gave this spring to an international conference of healthcare cost experts, ISPOR. Many of you may be familiar with that organization, about the unintended consequences of international reference pricing. So Lou and Andras, we'll turn it over to you. We look forward to your presentation, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. This is the moment where I can't find my slides. Okay. So are we okay on slides then? Can you see that?
Yes. Looks terrific.
I kind of need to find my camera too, don't I? So hang on just a second. Let me try that. Didn't turn the camera on before I started, so. I'm not seeing my camera icon, I'm sorry. So maybe I should just go without that, you think, or can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. We can give you another minute to try to find your camera icon. If not.
Let me just go ahead without it for now.
Okay, then terrific.
You can turn it on, I'm sorry about that. But here I found it up at the top now, sorry, okay. Apologies for that. Okay, so let me thank you all for the opportunity to present our research on this topic. Jenny has laid out the issues, the executive order on lowering drug prices. I'm based at, actually, we've changed our name to the Choice Institute at the University of Washington. I'm also a visiting fellow at the Office of Health Economics in London, and Andras is based in Basel as Akceso Advisors, and he's speaking to us today from Hungary. Okay, so let me double check, see if I move to the next slide. My cursor is not working right. Okay, are we on the disclosure slide, Jenny?
Yes, Lou.
All right, okay, I just
working well.
Thank you, I'm sorry about the hiccups here. What we would be discussing today is some research collaboration supported by pharma. We have collaborators Jaime Espen from Spain and Zoltan Kalo from Hungary. And as Jenny said, it's based on a presentation that we gave at ISPOR in May. We both work for numerous companies, but the views we're expressing today are our own views and not those of our institutions or probably even each other. So we heard different points of view. But we did call this kind of some interesting English, who's shooting whose foot. You know, we had to debate how you write that. So, but it was about international reference pricing, US versus the rest of the world. And I was offering kind of the US health economist perspective. So international reference pricing is called under many acronyms, one of them being external price referencing. We'll try to stay with IRP for this. And as you all know, we started, this has been a hot issue over the last few years as drug prices continue to increase or high and rising. And there's been a lot of discussion from the Trump administration, including an IPI model that was discussed just for Part B. There's a HR 3, which is received, from the House of Representatives. And the CBO projected that an act linking prices could produce savings over 10 years, but it would result in fewer drugs being produced. Now, so just a couple of weeks ago, I guess it's September 13th, so not that long ago, we received this new executive order lowering drug prices by putting America first. The three key elements were the clause most favored nation price, which was defined a little differently than the earlier IPI. But it's been refined to talk about U.S. prices should be compared to prices in other countries with similar GDP per capita, but also some adjustment for volume. And that's a new twist that really is not explained. Obviously, it's a very short document. But it also, the bigger change is it goes from Part B to Part D, which is much greater spending, I think, like 100 billion, versus 30 billion. Now, the interesting thing is they were a little cautious by saying, these are what we want to do, but we need to test the payment model. So they didn't say we need to implement this, on January 22nd. Okay, they said we're going to have to test this. So obviously, there's been a lot of pushback from many folks, and this will take quite a while. What I want to do, I'll start off with kind of some general background on what I see as the economics of drug development, and then Andras will speak more specifically about what's happening in Europe and how our project relates to that. I mean, our basic project is looking at when a company introduces a product, at a certain what's their pricing strategy and how does that roll out? And he'll talk about a couple of different strategies. And they affect access. I mean, the obvious point is if we were to maintain one high price worldwide, then poor countries could not afford the price that the US could afford. So we actually need differential pricing, which I'll say more about. But I like to remind people about the nature of drug development. It's high risk, high reward. We only produce 30 to 50 new drugs a year. You can see from the recent experience, there's no hockey stick here. This is a flat trajectory. The other important point is that medicines are essentially global public goods. They're information. Everyone can essentially see that information. Now and so because of what are called free rider problems, as I'm sure you're all aware, we basically have to intervene in the market to provide an incentive for people to produce information. So we do that by the patent system, giving 20-year patents. And now in the case of pharmaceuticals, it probably takes 8 to 10 years to actually reach the market. So they essentially are operating with about 12 years of patent life to try to recoup the investment. So that creates a lot of pressures on their side to try to see what the market will bear in terms of prices. At the same time, we also subsidize the production of science through the NIH and other entities. So these are global public goods. There's the free rider problem. And so that comes up. I want to say obviously, I don't think people would appreciate how few there are. The productivity is flat. And you'll see on the left that the mix is changing. And we're seeing a lot more drugs that are for orphan diseases, 44%. So I think that speaks to the science, but many of you are probably aware of those issues more than I am. Now, this was a nice paper by Patricia Danzin, who's now retired at Wharton, and she's done some of the best work on this issue for 20 years, say, and on differential pricing. And she looked at some Canadian data, and these are list prices, not after rebates. But even with list prices in the US on the left are 3 times higher than all these other countries, which are OECD countries. And you can see that the orange diamonds are the GDP per capita. And you can see there's not any correlation really between the price level. And I guess there's a correlation in that the US has got a high price and a relatively high level, but across the rest of the countries, there's no real correlation. So I will say that Danzin and others advocate, I mean, most health economists advocate differential pricing to support this kind of global fixed R&D effort, that people should contribute based on their ability and willingness to pay. But there's a real disparity between the US and the rest of the world here. But there's also the thing that they also a change that she picked up in the Canadian data, and this was companies had to submit a package to the Canadian authorities reporting on their price levels. So that made this kind of analysis possible. But one thing you see here on the right is that US prices over the period 2005 to 2016, the relative price of the US to Canada increased from 1.8 to 3.0. So it's not surprising that we're hearing a lot in the US about what's happening with our prices. Understandably, the House Ways and Means Committee has done a similar analysis, and you can see on the left of this graph that the GDPs of the countries that they looked at were about 80% of the US, but the pricing level was 26.9%. And what it sort of says down on the right, well, if we were to charge the same price as the Canadians, that it would result in a rebate of 75%. So, I mean, the truth is the US is financing the majority of R&D for the world. And so in that sense, people are, you could say people are free riders, but sort of only the extent to which high income countries aren't really contributing their fair share. So economists, and Patricia Danzin wrote on this in 2003, and with Adrian Towles on what I consider the seminal paper, basically laying out the case for differential pricing. So if you've taken some economics, we're talking about, we've granted a temporary monopoly to a pharmaceutical company, and they're going to behave like a monopolist. So if we want to sort of push back, if we want to control that incentive for them to behave like a monopolist, we need some sort of a counterbalancing force. But the other big point is, after we've borne the cost of drug development, which come to about $2 to $3 billion per new molecular entity, the marginal cost of making the medicine is often very low. I mean, we saw that in HIV, where now we have a triple combination therapy available in Africa for $125 a year. Whereas we're still charging, I don't know, $20,000 to $30,000 a year for the latest HIV compounds to finance that in the US. And that's appropriate. That's what we would argue for. From the company's point of view, as long as they can cover their marginal costs, they would be, they're still making some money, so they're happy with that. It provides access in the case of the HIV drugs in Africa. So it has equity implications. But when you look at the US and we start to look at the drug prices in relation to output, and the lower slide on the left looks at cancer drugs and overall survival, the correlation between what companies are being rewarded or paid for their innovation is very low in relation to that innovation. The price and the outcome are low. At the same time, the costs of drug development are rising, and we can see in this study by Ernie Burnt and others that looking at cohorts of data, that at the margin, things are good, that at the marginal case, it's not as profitable as people imagine, and it's kind of break even. And, I worked, before coming to the University of Washington, I worked at Syntex and then Roche, and I was in Basel in 2002 to 2004, head of health economics and pricing. And, the experience was with Syntex, we had naproxen sodium, which you probably have all heard of. That was the franchise that really funded the Syntex, and we didn't come up with another blockbuster, and Roche bought us for some of the pipeline. So there's no guarantee. It's not a license to print money. You can go out of business, and we see mergers and acquisitions all the time. So you got this general picture of prices rising to cover the rising costs and pressures on the industry. So the big, those who have the big winners like Sovaldi or these breakthrough drugs, they get a much higher, they get a much bigger return than, say, the average in the industry. So it's a very competitive situation. And again, if you think about Sovaldi, it was kind of a breakthrough for Hep C, but then within a couple of years, there are 3 or 4 competitors. So there are a lot of pressures there. Now, economists deal a lot with, make a distinction, and really interested in talking about what we call dynamic efficiency. And the question is, how do we promote optimal innovation? What would that be? And we have to look at it globally. Now, the countries each have their own pricing, regime. So in the US, we're a free pricing regime. Whereas if you enter in Germany, you end up in negotiations with the central government. In the UK, the same situation, except the UK uses metrics like the quality adjusted life year. And you could think of it, their view is we have an annual budget and we're trying to get the optimal health out of that annual budget. So we use this cost per quality, this cost effectiveness analysis to achieve static efficiency. But the question is, well, what are the implications for dynamic efficiency? So if you're getting the lowest price in the world by using your bargaining power as a monopsony buyer versus a monopolist, then you end up free riding on the rest of us, and R&D will be lower over time. Well, how much? And there has been a few studies, and as you can imagine, there's not a controlled trial, but trying to look into some natural experiments. There certainly is an effect of the amount of the R&D spending on how much innovation we get. And so this one nice study basically said, it takes on average 2.5 billion is required in additional revenue to support the invention of one new chemical entity. So there is some responsiveness here, even though there is, I think you could argue, there is a science drive in all this. Now, interesting, this study came out in just the past couple of weeks and by some very renowned analysts in our field, and it's in the journal Health Affairs. And it basically is looking at mortality data and finding that you could argue that you could estimate that pharmaceuticals contributed to 35% of the improvement in mortality. So these pharmaceuticals matter. They're not the most dominant thing. I mean, we're in a situation of the social determinants of health, but you can see that it matters. So basically, we have what I call the big trade-off here between innovation and access. We give someone a monopoly. You give someone a monopoly. In general, they're going to set higher prices than you would have in a competitive market. Now, this market is different in that if you have good insurance, you're protected. But the point is, the monopoly returns will have more drugs in the long term, higher prices, so a trade-off in access. We would see historically, when I was in Europe, Eastern Europe would not have the same utilization rates as Western Europe because of these higher prices, and there wasn't a way to offer lower prices. But on the other hand, if we don't have this whole enterprise, we're not going to have these medicines in the long term. So in terms of who's shooting whose foot, we basically say with IRP, we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot. We'll get less innovation, and because these are global public goods, everybody else in the world will be worse off as well. That's not to say that all invention, all innovation is good. You can have too much of a good thing, because what if it means we're giving up other things? And so we have to be worried about that trade-off. On the other hand, we're sitting here in COVID-19, wishing that we had actually had some more innovation, but pleased that we had things like all this science around adeno-associated viruses, so we can look at new types of vaccines. So what's the question is, well, what's the alternative? Yes, we do need to get prices under control. We don't have prices closely linked to value, and we can talk more about this. But basically, we talk about value-based pricing, trying to measure cost effectiveness and the cost per quality, and then we need to understand and promote the idea that we need to have global differential pricing. So let me turn it over to Andras to talk about our project and some of the experience in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou, and thanks for inviting me for this. If you want to move to the next slide, please. So what is international reference pricing? It's taking one drug and setting the price of that drug in your country based on the price of the same drug in a set of preset of another set of and according to a given algorithm. So the algorithm can be the lowest of all the basket countries or an average or whatever. Now, because the countries are very closely interlinked and many of them apply in Europe and outside of Europe, this international reference price setting, you could see that even tiny countries like Estonia in the north of Europe can impact the price of Japan of the same drug, right? Now, all of these countries have some similarity in the way how they are, like in their healthcare system. They're very different than from what you have in the US. However, what happens that there are, because of the affordability differences of the different countries, what also Lou was mentioning before, actually companies need to make specific trade-offs and specific strategies to be able not to go through actually two types of failures. One of them is that there is like a circular reference, in the sense that the country A and country B can be actually referencing each other back and forth. And also due to this, and due to the fact that countries are reviewing the prices on a regular basis, you may face a race to the bottom, the price race to the bottom. So when a company launches a drug, it needs to accommodate at the same time the affordability differences. Like in the US, you have the good metric of, or a proxy of the affordability is the GDP per capita in the US, and in Australia, it's close to $60,000 a year, whereby Slovakia, a small country in the center of Europe, which by the way were also mentioned as part of the reference basket in the IPI initiative for the US. So Slovakia has a 17,000, so roughly 1/4 of the GDP per capita. So Slovakia cannot afford these price levels, what would be affordable, let's say, for the US or companies therefore need to raise the price, and actually they end up running an avoidance strategy. With the avoidance strategy, meaning that they avoid launching the drug in a low income, low price potential markets, and thereby, of course, they also avoid this IRP race to the bottom. The higher price countries, however, will then oftentimes, like the Frances of the world, or the Spains or Italy, they will be actually forced into this tighter price corridor. So if you can show the next slide, please. The implication is twofold. On one hand, if you look at the lower part of the chart, that the high prices in the lower market potential countries, typically these smaller markets in Europe currently that have lower affordability, or avoidance of launching these drugs in these markets, so limited access to the drugs. If you can show the chart. And on the top part, the lower prices in the higher market potential countries, so meaning that they are not paying their fair share for the drug, what they could in terms of the affordability and the willingness and ability to pay. And that ends up to result in less R&D, less research, less innovation. What we did in our research, please, the next slide, we looked at how does this manifest itself in real life, and we looked at the products launched, the drugs, new chemical entities launched in between, like in the year 2015, they were registered. Within 5 years, what you expect that these drugs should be available, should be made available to patients actually in all of the countries. Now, what we saw that in the upper tertiary, so the upper part in terms of affordability of the countries, over 80% of these drugs were available to patients. However, for the lower income countries, and if you can show the other part, please, of the slide. So in the lower income countries with a lower market potential, it's only half of them were made available. So that has actually two implications. On one hand, the patients in these countries, they actually do not get access to those drugs. And the second implication is that, of course, companies who have developed and are selling these drugs, they don't have the revenues coming from these countries either. And so therefore, their availability of funds for research and development and innovation is lower. Now, what does this imply for the US? If we take what would, from our perspective, from a European perspective, if we extrapolate what we have seen here. Importantly, the US has been growing in terms of the impact or the contribution in research and development and innovation. So over a 40-year period, from roughly 30% of all innovative treatments have been invented in the US. For the last couple of years, it went up to nearly double to that, 57%. So that means that we believe that innovation and thereby the generation of funds for innovation in the US through the revenues, what you should generate, what pharma companies should generate out of their business should be essential, right? Now, however, and if we look at the next slide, please, if we consider what could potentially the executive order mean, Lou has mentioned the price differential of Australia to the US, and what we also in our own research have confirmed, that there is roughly 75% lower price, ex-factory price or ex-manufacturer price across the board on average in Australia versus the US. Of course, what I mentioned, the GDP per capita is similar to that of the US. So there might be, from that perspective, comparable countries. Will this mean that with the implementation of the executive order, there would be an at least 75% price cut? Drugs, Medicare Part B and D drugs, eventually even beyond. That's the question. Now, if that's the case, what would be the implications? And we look at three perspectives, or two short-term time horizon and the long-term higher time horizon, and the in-market drugs and the drugs in launch. So what could be these potential probable scenarios? If I look at the short-term in-market drugs, if we're getting this, yes. So on the left-hand side of the chart, what you see, what we could expect in terms of the static efficiency, yes, the price cuts in the US would mean a better resource utilization in the short term. At the same time, analog to what companies have been doing in Europe, like for example, when in Slovakia, we also already mentioned Slovakia. Slovakia at some point of time, a few years ago, introduced a more strict type of international reference pricing. Companies were very, let's say, they worked out very elaborate ways on how to pull out the market from Greece in similar situations. So there will be a freezing of market access in other countries, not to jeopardize the US market further on with the in-market drugs. In the center, what we see, what would happen with launch drugs, again in the short term. What we would expect, again, seeing what happens in countries which have lower potential and lower price potential and lower market potential, the companies are not willing to sacrifice these, so they run these avoidance strategies. They don't want to jeopardize high price and high volume markets. So what we would expect that for new drugs, there would no or very little price concessions in the US, and the pharma revenues would be obviously at the end lower. Of course, patient access would be also more limited. In the long term, looking at the right-hand side, what we would expect that through both of these short-term impacts for different reasons, but at the end, there will be less funds available for drug development. We have seen this 2.5 billion estimate. There are different publications between 1.6 and 2.5 to 2.6 billion. So that cumulative revenue will not be available in that abundance to be able to do the research and generate the new chemical entities. Availability of drugs to patients will be thereby lower. So as a conclusion, if we can look at the next slide, what we have already shown and explained at the ISPOR panel, we would have a not so positive effect, let's say more negative consequences for patients and pharma alike, especially because the US has a very different healthcare system than than actually all of the countries, what they would be referencing. And additionally to this, and if we can have the same slide, but the build, please. So what we would expect that the initiators of these measures will not meet their expectations. At the same time, there we see some controversy as well in terms of implementation. How can be America first if it needs to have another country to have a price first? So, and the last slide to reiterate what also Lou was mentioning, we believe a better alternative could be the value-based approach, all for patients, researchers, and pharma alike. So value-based pricing, reward versus value, very importantly, better management and appropriate global differential pricing, and maintaining confidential discounts to be able to manage this affordability gap between the different countries. Thank you.
All right, terrific. Well, I think we're going to open it up for questions. Perhaps we see.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to stop share. Sorry.
Okay, no, it's no problem.
Having trouble, but anyway. So.
And hopefully those on have seen Lou and Andras's bios in the chat. And we do have a number of questions. Okay, well, now I see myself. Let's start with the questions. I'm going to open the chat box, and my colleague Sarah Chang is going to help me. But let me start off with a first question around vaccines. So if we look at vaccines in the context of the economic incentives that you've discussed, where do vaccines fit in, and how will the distribution of vaccines be determined globally?
Andras, do you want to speak to that first? Let me try to get to, somehow I'm on mute again. Am I on mute? It says I'm on mute.
You're good. You're good, Lou.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, Andras, if you have any thoughts on that first, or.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. You know, there are lots of initiatives in trying to get equitable access to potentially developed vaccinations. And many countries are developed, and developing countries are part of those. Next to these, however, I believe that all developed countries are trying to ensure the access, to secure access to their share of the vaccinations as much as feasible, and their individual deals. Certainly in terms of the international reference pricing, I don't expect that IRP element in determining these price levels. It will be much more, let's say, and typically anyway with vaccinations, that's not the case, that IRP would be very strongly involved, but I don't expect here. Lou?
Yeah, let me just, it's not an area that I'm actually involved on a day-to-day basis, but I will put in a pitch for my colleagues at the Office of Health Economics in London, who work with people at the Center for Global Development. They had a very good webinar on vaccine pricing and what's coming out through the pipeline, and so that's available. And then ISPOR will be having a webinar with Adrian Taus from the Office of Health Economics in November on this topic of vaccine pricing. So they've been doing the most thinking. Calypso Chocolado of Center for Global Development and Adrian have really, they've looked at the portfolio. There's new information coming out on that. So there's a lot of information, a lot of uncertainty, and just how, you know, the lack of kind of global cooperation is a problem. But on the other hand, it's exciting that we have so many, we're trying to bring so many candidates through. For those of you who've been in drug development like I have, you know, the reason it's high risk is 8 out of 10 products fell in the pipeline, and there's just a lot of uncertainty about these things. You're probably aware that we've been trying for many years to have an AIDS vaccine, it's not just a matter of throwing money at the problem. I mean, look at Alzheimer's disease, how long it's taken to make some progress. So, you know, on the other hand, sometimes the science, such as gene therapy, comes and gives us tools to do things, and it can kind of push innovation.
Terrific.
But, yeah.
I'm gonna stop you, Lou. We could go on. That's a big topic. But we have a number of other questions that we'd like to get to, and I'm going to turn to Sarah to pose some of those.
Thanks, Jenny. Speaking of another big topic, this one's on the value-based pricing that you referenced at the end of the presentation. Value-based pricing in the US is just now developing due to barriers in the reimbursement system. Do other countries have frameworks available to currently allow for the value-based pricing? And will our US legal and regulatory landscape need to be modified before we can start?
Well, why don't I go first, Andras, on that? Well, actually, there are, first of all, the US is complicated, as you know. We have multiple, you know, we have the Medicare and Medicaid programs, we have the private sector market, we have the VA, and the prices that are paid are different across those. We do actually have some differential pricing within the US. The Medicaid program gets a discount on medicines. The VA has a lower price than the market, than the price in the private sector. And each of those they're negotiating in their own situation. Now, we don't, in terms of learning from other countries, there are actually a range of approaches. Places like the Commonwealth countries of Great Britain, I mean, the UK, Australia, Canada, rely on this cost effectiveness analysis and the cost per quality, and try to use that as a benchmark on the value of products. And that's a kind of value, that's value-based pricing. At the other extreme is kind of Germany at this point, which relies much more on the clinical data and a negotiation with the pharmaceutical company based on the clinical data, which works better if you're in the same class of drugs, but if you're a totally new drug for a new problem, the question is how well does that work? So ISPOR had a task force, and we basically, in 2018, and issued a report saying we thought that the US, and this was led by health economists, the US does need to move more towards a cost per quality approach, quality adjusted life year, but recognizing the limitations of the quality and that certain modifications and adjustments are necessary. And I will say, in the last 5 years, we've had the introduction of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review in the United States, which adopts a very NICE-like approach, a cost per quality approach, and then puts out, it's not a government organization, it's an independent nonprofit that essentially makes suggestions about what a value-based price would be. And that influences the negotiations between the private payers and the manufacturers in the US. So we are moving in that direction.
Terrific. Sarah, I think we have a whole bunch of other questions.
We do. This next one, do price differentials in any way affect where private sector R&D is conducted? And as part of that, where academic industry partnerships can take place?
Andras, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to first? Whatever.
Yeah, maybe because it was breaking up a bit. So
well, I would just say that, I mean, obviously, if you saw the price differential between the US and the rest of the world, the answer is yes. I mean, price differentials affect where the R&D is done. And the US is essentially financing the majority of global R&D. Now, you could say, I mean, we are in a sense, the wealthiest country in the world, and we value health more than others. We're at 18% of GDP. No other country is above 15%. It's important to remember also that the majority of, pharmaceuticals make up 10 to 20% of the spending. Physicians and hospitals make up another 60%. So, and the reason US prices are higher is US prices are higher in all those elements compared to other countries. So we reward our inputs more than other countries. So yes, it does affect where the research is done, and it does, and in a sense, the U.S. is subsidizing the rest of the world, but we're also benefiting from this innovation ourselves, and we value it. And the question is, at the margin, are we getting the best? Are we getting the innovations we want? And I guess we're saying we don't know unless we have a value-based reward system to line that up better.
maybe if I can add one or two thoughts to this. So it's true that the US takes, we have seen the big chunk of the investment into the research and development. At the same time, this 10 to 20% share of the healthcare cost going into pharmaceuticals, that's true for the US and true for some developed countries, but it's not true for many middle income countries. So many countries also 5%. So by that, what it also means that actually if a US company is developing a drug and it's marketing the drug, then actually some of this is recuperated from a disproportionate level also from other smaller countries. So it's not so clear cut for me. Yes, in the US, actually there is also a flow back of the revenues and the profit from all of this investment.
Very good. Sarah, I think I'll jump in. I see a question here that looks like right up their alley. So it was mentioned that there's been growing attention from biopharmaceutical companies in diseases for orphan or rare diseases. How would the executive order impact this sector in regards to the pipeline innovation and global pricing?
I haven't thought specifically about that. I don't know, Andras, do you want to take that first and then I can go, or I'm happy to go first, whatever you want.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So I mean, I'm thinking a bit aloud as well. You know, I don't think anything is specifically stated in the executive order about the orphan drugs. What happens though that companies, due to the preferential treatment of orphan drugs, both in the US and in Europe, have been also in terms of the freedom or bigger freedom to price them also outside of the US and Europe, have been developing a number of these new medications in the orphan space. And there you can also see a lower price differential between the US and Europe than many of the non-orphan indications. So what I would expect that for the orphan drug pricing would not be impacted so heavily than many of the non-orphan drugs.
I think that's right. I mean, as Andras hit it nail on the head there, that basically incentive to maintain a differential is different for orphan drugs. You know, you don't really want to have a big differential from the company's point of view. So it's not going to, it wouldn't be impacted as much through referencing, looking at other countries.
I want to probe a little bit more about value. I think we probably have time for this question and then one more. Lou, you've talked about the need for a broader concept of value, and you mentioned the ISPOR task force that you were on, but can you just tell us briefly, I might add, you know, what are some of the metrics and new types of data, like, for example, from real world data, that could really help us capture value in a way to really deploy it as we determine drug and other medical prices?
Yeah, that's a great question. I separate kind of the need for real world data, which I think is critical, from a broader concept of value. I mean, and the truth is our system, all of us are patients too, you know, and we know that there aren't incentives to strong incentive to generate real world data. Hence, we have the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. So we all know as patients we don't have enough data, and we know that places like ICER should revise their analysis once real world data become available, because at launch the data are limited, but that's when the first price, you know, that's what the first price is set. But in terms of value, we basically said the quality, you know, is a good approximation. It captures length of life and quality of life, which sounds like about everything, all right, in terms of health gain. But actually there are other psychological dimensions to health, including reducing your uncertainty. So, you know, a lot of diagnostics say, you know, tell you you're going to benefit from the drug. That's valuable. It's a reduction in uncertainty. And some of these elements are not captured in the quality, or even something like scientific spillover. So the thing is, in our system, if a company tries to develop a product and it fails, they receive no revenue. but everyone working in that space benefits from that knowledge that they generate from their failure. So our system doesn't really take into account scientific spillovers. And then there are all these issues around equitable access. So there are other, we have something we call the value flower, which lays out a lot of these other elements that should be considered in adjusting the quality and augmenting the quality.
Thanks, Lou. So we have one more question, and then we're going to move on to a few Alliance member items. Sarah?
Yes, last question. This one is asked to Dr. Garrison, but Andras, if you want to jump in as well. Is there any data to show that if U.S. payers follow ICER recommendations, when the recommended prescription is more expensive than the current standard of care?
There have been some studies looking at the impact of ICER, and I don't, I would just say there is some impact, and I certainly see it when I'm working as a consultant to companies, that they're very conscious that they may be examined by ICER. And so they're building models to figure out what they think would be, how many they've built their own internal cost effectiveness model, and ICER is going to do the same. So they're very conscious of it. Obviously if you have a breakthrough product and a lot of monopoly power, then, it's hard to deny you. But I would say just keep in mind, a lot of these spaces such as gene therapy, they're actually more competitive than you realize. A lot of people have figured out the technology and are coming with competitors. Andras, do you want to add anything to that briefly? So.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Also, when we talk about maybe just one more thought about the CAR-T therapies and managed entry agreements, or which are kind of a proxy to value-based pricing, at least value-based access with outcome-based arrangements. So a number of countries actually do introduce these now, and because of the length of the impact on the healthcare budget versus the one-off application of this treatment. So with the managed entry agreements and with the newcomers and gene therapies and cell therapies, I believe there is much more room for also for higher cost therapies being funded one way or the other than the current standard of care.
All right, well, terrific. What a meaty and thoughtful topic. We often, I can't say we have a lot of economists on. We certainly have, Mark McClellan, for example, but terrific to have this conversation. And this challenge of ensuring the continuation of R&D investment, robust R&D investment while addressing medical costs, such as drug costs, is one that Research America is certainly very concerned about and will continue to pursue. So thank you so much.
Let me say thank you for the opportunity and invite people to write to us if they have questions. We'd be happy to do it, and really appreciate your dedication to science. So we're there too. So thank you.
Terrific. And we'll be posting your deck so people can have access to your slides. Thanks so much.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye. So just a few very quick announcements. Please check our homepage for updates on the supplemental. We have a new banner there, which we are updating, as well as any new action alerts related to the supplemental. Since we know that the Speaker and Treasury Secretary seem to still be talking, which is very good. And I just wanted to make a quick pitch for engagement in Vote Science Strong. Hopefully you've all received information about that. If not, let's put the link in the chat. This week, what we're asking you to do is to reach out to the members of your organization who live in the districts where teletown halls are happening. On the Vote Science Strong site, you can very easily see where senators and folks running for Senate and House are doing teletown halls. And you can join those and ask important science questions and biomedical research questions. So we encourage you to do that, and just to take part in the other activities that we hope the Vote Science Strong site makes easy for you to do, tweeting, Facebook posting, etc., but all to really try to increase the volume of discussion around the importance of science in the next few weeks before the election. Lastly, next week, we have Becky Williams, who's the acting director of clinicaltrials.gov, and Anna Fine, her deputy director. They will be talking about the modernization effort undergoing now at clinicaltrials.gov. So that's next Thursday at 2:30 p.m. and we will be sending you information to log on. Thank you so much. We really, again, appreciate the great attendance we've been having on these webinars. And now that we have the forum behind us, we'll be picking up the pace on the webinars and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much.